The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Why did he use that word?
God goes to extreme measures to bring the lost to himself.
The greatest gift you will ever give this world is your intimacy with God.
The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all three inside of me. I've got the power right now.
I think what Jesus really wants is people to go. I want to be the answer to Jesus' prayer request.
Welcome to the Fuel for the Harvest podcast.
When this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, then shall the end come.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. This is Nathan, and I will be your host for today. Hope you are doing so well. Today we're going to continue in our little mini-series here on lessons that Charlie and I have learned in ministry over the course of the last 10 or so years. And today we continue on with one that I believe is quite simple, but quite important. So I don't expect this episode to take very long, but I hope still that you find it to be a blessing. And that lesson is to remember what God has done. So all throughout the scriptures, there's dozens of references that we could talk about here, both in the New and Old Testament. We see a call on the people of God, be they Christians or the Israelites or whatever, whomever, a call on the people of God to remember what God has done. And I think that there's a lot of really good reasons to remember what God has done. But I think that the kind of the clearest and most obvious one in Scripture is that it builds our faith. The idea is that if God has been faithful before and shown that he's faithful, how much more confident can we be that he'll be faithful again? It would be one thing if we were trying to have faith in someone who had no credibility, but we're having faith in someone who has an incredible amount of credibility. I like to say that as modern day Christians, we have the least amount of excuse to have little faith, because unlike Abraham, who all the way back in the day literally only had one sentence from God, get up from here and go to that place, on which to base his entire decision making. That's what we have documented. He has this one little tiny conversation with God on which to base everything. Meanwhile, thousands of years later, we have an incredible amount of testimony of who God is and all of the ways that he's been faithful, both in the Old Testament and New Testament. And we, as modern day Christians, have the benefit of 2,000 years of testimonies from Christian history. God has been faithful. And it's important for us to remember these things. And it's not just important kind of at a global scale, like look at what God has done for the body of Christ globally or for individuals kind of throughout history. I think it's also important for us in our day-to-day lives to remember what God has done. Just take note of a couple of times in the scriptures. There are a couple of times in the book of Deuteronomy where the people are encouraged to remember what God has done for them in taking them up out of Egypt. Of course, Deuteronomy is occurring right before they enter into the promised land. So basically they go to Mount Sinai, they get the laws, then they go to the promised land and send the 12 spies in. The 10 spies come back and say, this is not a good idea. And the 2 spies say, yeah, it is. We can do this. God's with us. And the people go with the 10 spies. And so God says, your punishment is to walk around in the desert for 40 years, basically saying an entire generation of you needs to die out. And so right before they head into the promised land, Moses gives the law again in the book of Deuteronomy. Deutero, meaning second, nomi, meaning law in Greek. A lot of times in this book, Moses is saying, hey, remember what God has done so that you don't make the same mistakes as your ancestors. So that's one of many noteworthy examples. There's many in the Psalms. There's many all over the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, there are plenty. Perhaps the most notable one would be Hebrews chapter 11, where the author of Hebrews, of course we don't know who that is, but the author of Hebrews shares a whole list of all of these people of faith, basically saying, he summarizes it in the beginning of chapter 12, hey, look at all these people. They've lived faithful lives and God has come through for them. You should also live a life full of faith because God will also come through for you. All that to say, it is definitely a scriptural mandate. And like I said, it's really important that we don't just see this as something that's important for other people, I mean, how many times have we heard from leaders or pastors or ministers in our lives, hey, write down what God's doing in your life. And so many times we say, oh, I'll remember. I just really encourage you, begin the sometimes time consuming but oh so rewarding process of writing down what God has done. And it'll have a couple of cool functions for you. Number one, if you take note of like things that you're praying, for example, and the ways that God is coming through in those prayers, you'll be excited and it will help your faith in your prayer life. It'll build your faith in your prayer life. Like as you see God answering prayers, you'll become more confident that he'll answer other prayers that you're asking, which is awesome. When it comes to moments in your life, not only will you see God's faithfulness, which will build your faith and make you more confident moving forward, but you'll also be able to track the growth and the journey that God has taken you on. I remember early on in my own ministry, like the smallest little kind of God moment was so big for me. Because it was the first time I was ever seeing these kinds of things happen. Like it was the very first time that I would share my faith with somebody. So I'm like writing it down furiously, so excited that like God would think or consider using some, silly, ordinary person like me to share the gospel with somebody. Like that was a really big deal. Now it's just kind of how I intend and try to live my life. And so I don't find myself writing down those things as often, even though I probably should be. But looking back, it's fun to watch the trajectory that God has taken my life on, and how things that feel so ordinary now, things that just feel are like hearing God's voice and taking action and loving people and being generous and sharing the gospel and all of these things that were like so big to me in the early days are now just like, this is like a Tuesday. And I don't mean to undermine what God is doing. Don't hear me wrong. Simply to say, like, look at the growth. Like my life is so different. And I think that you would see the same thing as you track it in your life. So not only tracking like prayers and answered prayers, but also just tracking those God moments would be really, really good. What this does is it helps us to remember. Ultimately, it helps us to remember, and perhaps one of the most important things for me in my life is knowing that if God is faithful to me in the past, surely he will be faithful to me again. I'm sure you guys have heard us say this on the podcast in the past, but as a man in American culture, there's this incredible pressure to provide for your family. And we've told you in the past, like Charlie and I are both, support-based, kind of like missionaries. So we have to raise funds to pay not only for our salary, but for travel expenses and things like that. And it can be nerve-wracking because you don't get into ministry for the money. Like, it can be nerve-wracking wondering, like, how am I going to afford a house where my family can live? Or how am I going to be able to pay all the bills? Or how am I going to be able to go to the hospital when we need to go to the hospital? Because we all know how difficult that is in America right now. Like, all of those things are so challenging that it's easy to start getting in your head like, oh man, you get into panic mode and you start thinking, okay, so yeah, I'm going to serve God, but also I have to make money. And just like Jesus says, you can only serve one master. Either you love the one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other. And then he says you can't serve both God and stuff, God and mammon, stuff, or God and money. You can't seek after the stuff of this life and God. You have to seek after one or the other. All that to say, it happens. Like, it sneaks in. You think to yourself, well, I'm just I'm a man. It's expected of me that I'm going to provide for my family, and all of a sudden, your heart is divided, and you're wrestling with, man, should I even do ministry in light of the fact that I can't make enough money in order to do the things that are needed for my family? In steps all of the ways that God has been so faithful over the course of the last many years that I've been tracking it. And what happens is you begin to remember, oh, God came through. I don't have to, not that I won't work hard, not that I won't be diligent, not that I won't, do all those things, but I don't have to worry about money because Jesus himself says, don't worry about stuff, just worry about the kingdom. Seek first the kingdom and my righteousness, and just watch as I add these things to you. And if he's done it before, he'll do it again. And I've watched over and over as he has done it before and he does it again. And the only reason that I remember those things is because I write them down. And so all that to say, my encouragement to you today is to remember all that God has done and to not be so arrogant as I have been sometimes in the past to think, oh, I'll remember, and not track those things. I really encourage you twofold to track the God moments, the ways that you've seen God provide, the ministry moments, the spiritual growth moments, those kind of special moments in your life where you're like, man, God really did something here. Write those down so you can remember them. And then the prayers you've prayed and the prayers you've seen God answer, write those down. It will so bolster and encourage you as time moves forward, both growing your faith and reminding you that if God has been faithful before, surely he will be faithful again. So that's my encouragement, and please don't learn this lesson the hard way, and please don't be the person who thinks, oh, I'll remember, because if you live this life long enough, you'll realize that you won't remember all the cool things God has done. And what an unfortunate thing when you could have easily just whipped your phone out, turned on the voice thing, just talk to your phone and say, hey, this is what God did today, taking note of all the things that God has done. So all that to say, just remember what God has done, and remember to write it down so that you can remember in the future. Hope you guys find this encouraging and useful. Hope that God blesses you today. Have a good one.